Where do we stand today in terms of the pandemic, the lockdowns, the tyranny, and the oppression under which we live today? Join Richard Ebeling, Jeff Tucker, and me as we discuss this subject in this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle. The show, as many of you know, brings you the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel, and we got a special guest this week, Jeff Tucker. And Jeff, it's great to see you.
It's good to be here. I'm speaking to you from the library of the American Institute for Economic Research. I think Professor Ebeling spent some time here, and you both are welcome to come anytime.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the reasons.
Full year there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's one of the reasons we have you on. I mean, we've been in this movement for a long time, and you develop heroes in the movement like Mises and Rothbard and Hayek, many of whom are Leonard Reed that are long gone. But you also develop real life heroes, and you're one of my real life heroes, Jeff. You get it in this movement. You get it that freedom involves not just reforming welfare warfare state programs. Freedom involves the dismantling of infringements on freedom. Yeah. There's a lot of libertarians that either don't understand that or just are willing to settle for some kind of warmed over, revised serfdom. You're associated with the American Institute for Economic Research. Why don't you tell us a little bit about them?
We were founded in 1933, about the time when FDR stole everybody's gold. And E.C. Harwood was teaching at MIT at the time, and he said, this isn't going to do. So he began to oppose it. But then his university began to kind of frown on this, and it was difficult economic times. So he founded the American Institute for Economic Research to be an independent organization, independent of government, academia, or any big single donor, that could control the messaging. And he lived until 1980 and really built a beautiful institution. And I came along board after Ed Stringham was hired as my old friend, Edward Stringham was hired as president. Brought me on as the editorial director, and took me about 5 months to kind of get the hang of what we needed to be doing here. But the results have been quite spectacular. Our website traffic has been really great. And then, of course, the pandemic broke out, and along with it, the lockdowns. And I would say that AIR has been on the front lines now for 6 months, really 8 months, in opposing all government pandemic management, which, you could have known at the outset was going to be a disaster, but and I wish more people had been speaking out all along, but I'm encouraged in the recent days to see that our work seems to be making a difference.
Well, your foundation is one of the go-to sites that we go to at the Future of Freedom Foundation, and I know that Richard writes a weekly article for you, and you have an illustrious background. You worked at the Ludwig von Mises Institute, which is another one of my heroic institutions, and of course the Foundation for Economic Education. You work there. I worked there also as program director, so we have a lot in common. So it's great to have you here. You mentioned that the pandemic and the lockdowns, and you have a great article today coming out on that subject. So why don't you tell us a little bit, and we'll start out the show about what you think about what's going on in America now with respect to this pandemic.
I can tell you, I was thrilled to be able to write that article because, I'm a happy guy. I like to write about happy things, about the market. Wonderful it is. Last 6 months have not been happy. And I wrote my first article about this back January 27th, but I was warning about the government's quarantine power and saying that it shouldn't be used, that it's not going to help mitigate a disease. A disease is something to be managed by individuals and with medical care professionals and not the state. That was the position I took. And at the time, people were calling me on, because the Wuhan situation was all in the news, and people were calling me up going, why did you write such a ridiculous article? I said, what's ridiculous about it? And they said, well, the idea that government would just quarantine people, is completely crazy. We have a Bill of Rights, we have a constitution in this country, and the rule of law and a tradition of liberty. I mean, don't you think this is a little bit of a paranoid piece? I thought, well, I hope so. But I had a bad feeling about it even then. But then, of course, early March, we started seeing the clampdown come. South by Southwest was canceled by force, all the contracts mandatorily reneged on, and bad things started to happen. And it looked like we were going to adopt the China model. And then every day after that, it's just been darker and darker and darker ever since. And it's been sad. So I've just noticed in the last really several days, big changes happening, both in terms of the way the media is handling this, which has been egregious from the beginning, and in terms of real differences that are going on. One is that I think I start with an astonishing thing. A medical advisor to Boris Johnson, to the UK government, came out with a very blunt statement saying that the only reason they locked down is they didn't know what else to do. They were in a panic, and it was dumb, and it never should have happened, and it should never happen again. Now, that is an astonishing admission from a person very close to a government. There are only a handful that have happened over the last 8 months, if you can believe it. So that was a really important, almost represents a kind of a remarkable admission, and I think it's really important. Like, everybody's going to have to start doing this. Macron in France has said there will be no lockdowns, and that we can't live in a perfectly safe world, and we have to come to terms with the virus. That was important. Even Merkel hinted in that direction, that they needed more coordinated activities rather than just locking down country by country. That was important. The Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago ran a front page story by Greg Ip that said new thinking on the lockdowns. They should never have happened. A lot of experts are saying that a virus just has to run its course, and that a free society can actually suppress it. Okay, that's not new thinking. We've been saying that for 8 months, but it's important that it ran in the news section of the Wall Street Journal, not just the op-ed page, which has actually been fantastic from the beginning. And the CDC has made some changes. Now they've eliminated their recommended 14-day quarantine, which is really good, and their demand that asymptomatic people be tested by mandate. So that's gone now too. So you see these sort of signs of liberalization taking place. And what I'm wondering is whether and to what extent, once the narrative story about the lockdowns are good and virus suppression is the way to go, once that begins to unravel, it could all unravel very, very quickly. I hope so.
Richard?
Yeah, I hope you're right. If this turns out to be the new narrative by people who are more mainstream, then when history is written 5 years from now, 10 years from now, this is going to look like one of the most egregious and absurd governmental boondoggles that not has just wasted money, right? Government's been wasting our money for ages, and we all complain about it, but one that not only radically restricted the lives of hundreds of millions of people, but destroyed a good part of the global economy for nothing, for absolutely nothing. If we want a poster boy example of the irrationality and the disaster of government intervention on the premise of those who should be trusted to know better to then do what they think is right to us, this should be the glaring example for the rest of the century that government should not be trusted or turned to, and that we need to rethink how human problems should be solved, rather than the knee-jerk reaction, well, if there's a social dilemma, where's the closest government office?
I hope that is the result. Another really encouraging sign is that the National Bureau of Economic Research ran a paper that came out about 3 days ago, published by Atlanta Fed economist and a UCLA economist and an Emory University economist, and they used these really high-end statistical techniques that epidemiologists are not apparently very familiar with. The epidemiologists are forever confusing correlation, causation, and assuming that a sequence of time, can discern a causal relationship. These economists are much better. They took 25 countries and 25 states. They had a standard for why they chose those, and tried to correlate virus mitigation with lockdown stringency. And what they discovered was that what they discovered was that the virus does its own thing. And they came up with four general principles about what this virus does in every country. And they could not find any evidence that the so-called non-pharmaceutical mandated interventions that have been used around the world, from mandatory masks, social business closures, public events cancellations, school closures, all these travel restrictions, all these terrible things that have been done to us, that there was no relationship whatsoever between these measures of stringency and outcomes in terms of disease management. In other words, that there's no evidence that there's any relationship between what governments have done and the trajectory of the disease in terms of infections and death. So it's a devastating paper from three very mainstream people using the best possible statistical techniques out there. And I've sent it to some friends and said, look at this. And they said, why is all this apparatus necessary to say something that's very obvious? Namely, that governments can't control viruses. I said, yeah, I know, I get it. But still, it's a really important paper, and it's getting a lot of attention this week. So, and it seems, the paper seems almost irrefutable to me. So it's an incredible scandal, the amount of destruction that's happened. And actually, I would use the word that Donald Henderson, the great eradicator of smallpox, who tragically died in 2016. But in 2006, he wrote a paper against some of these epidemiological models that were recommending closures and non-pharmaceutical interventions and social distancing and all this stuff. And he said, if you do this, you will discredit public health authority and government for a generation, and you will produce an unprecedented catastrophe. That was his prediction. And I'd say his prediction turned out to be true.
Yes.
Well, let me put things in a broader context here. That, before this pandemic hit, we knew there were problems. There was a healthcare crisis. We know that. I mean, that was what Obamacare was all about. It was enacted because there was a healthcare crisis. And of course, things only got worse, which caused people to start calling for full socialized medicine. We have an economic crisis, monetary crisis. I mean, we saw the debt level was, I don't know, $23 trillion before the pandemic. Government spending out of control. The entitlements out of control, Social Security, Medicare, military spending. So you had this confluence of crises that came together, I think, with the pandemic, which is only going to make things significantly worse. And the thing about it is, Jeff, it seems to me that it's incumbent on us libertarians to use this as an opportunity to get people to look at what freedom really means. That people start getting focused when they're faced with these kind of deep crises of liberty, crises of life. There's people dying here. And maybe that's an opportunity for them to start listening to us. So we have options we can take. One option is, well, let's just criticize the president on what he's doing and what he's not doing. That he didn't have enough testing kits, or he didn't recognize the problem right away, or he's doing this or he's doing that. Well, to me, that gets you nowhere. That really what we were aiming for is a free society, which necessarily means in the healthcare arena, a total separation of healthcare and the state. Where if the state had not been involved in this, if there had been a constitutional prohibition against the federal government, and my preference would be the state governments too, like the 14th Amendment, applying, saying you will not have the power to regulate, control, manage healthcare, we would have come out of this with flying colors. We would have been looking at the free market, the healthcare industry to lead us out of it. It's a healthcare crisis. It's not a political crisis. There would have been no shutdowns, mandatory shutdowns. People, I think, would have deferred to the healthcare industry and said, give us guidance. What should we do? Should we wear masks and so forth? But you would have had a vibrant economy. While what they've done today is not only made it worse for the people that are suffering from this virus, but also economically, it's absolutely a disaster. And I think we've only seen the tip of the iceberg here. I think when they start, when the stimulus plan really starts working its way into the monetary system, we've already seen the dollar drop by, I think, what, 10% or so in value. When the prices, we've seen food prices soaring. When this thing starts flooding through the economy, especially if they do another stimulus, I think we're looking at a perfect storm of an economic crisis, a healthcare crisis, and a monetary crisis.
And
And this is our opportunity to cause people to think at a higher level.
I agree, and there's other problems too, right? The real estate liquidation, which is being stopped in a place like New York because of all these labor union contracts that are tied to commercial properties, and so they can't sell them. They're practically trying to give them away, and even then they can't get rid of them. So the market is not actually working for this reason. So there's a lot of liquidation that's going to be taking place in larger cities right now due to this. So I agree with you. The calamity that we're going to see in the coming 18 to 24 months is unspeakable. And by the way, if we would just open up and start traveling again and start being free to go to work and being normal people again, then I mean that would be a huge improvement. But yes, we're still going to be faced with tremendous economic and cultural and social carnage. I mean, as an example of cultural carnage, I mean, what's happened to the arts in this country over the last 8 months has been catastrophic. I mean, everything's been canceled. Everything from Broadway, unbelievable. Tanglewood, bars and restaurants have stopped hiring musicians. Choirs haven't been able to allowed to meet. In many parts of the world, the organ has been banned on grounds that it's a disease spreader because the air comes out of the pipes. I mean, the whole thing is sheer madness. To put the world back together again is going to be very difficult. And I think, as you say, we need to get our principles straight. The way to put the world back together again is through human rights and a consistent application of freedom, where we have a strict separation between the state and medicine. You know, you said that earlier about how we should have just treated this as a normal virus. And that's the way America has done it through most of the 20th century. That's what we did in 68, 69 with the Hong Kong flu that killed 100,000 people, but with a much smaller population base and a much younger population. And that's what we did in 1957, 58. The New York Times wrote in both those cases one small editorial saying, we've got a flu. If you feel sick, go to your doctor, but otherwise don't panic. Now, that was the attitude of the public intellectuals at the time. And then in 1948 through 51, we had a polio epidemic that was actually really terrifying. I mean, taking young girls the age of 7 and 9 and crippling them for life. And the Polio Foundation started what later became the March of Dimes. And FDR wanted to be its kind of spokesman, because he himself was a victim of polio. And you know what the foundation said? They said, absolutely not. We don't want you speaking on our behalf, because that will only politicize our cause. And there should be an absolute separation between disease management and mitigation and politics. That was the principles back even under the FDR and FDR's time. And that was a principle that we as a nation forged after the 1918 Spanish flu, where there were catastrophic quarantines in selected cities and mask mandates in selected cities like San Francisco and Chicago, never in New York and never through most of the rest of the country, but in those places. And what social scientists and medical experts learned from that was never do this again. It didn't work. It didn't improve disease outcomes, and it made everybody mad and wrecked the economy. Okay, that's the principle we used for 100 years. Somehow in the 21st century, we forgot it all. And we went back to these 1918 strategies, even worse, medieval strategies, even worse. Even in the Middle Ages and the bubonic plague, they didn't quarantine people who were well. So this is an unprecedented disaster.
Well, as you had these predictions coming out early on from these research centers in London. You know, millions are going to die within a short period of time. How do you do this? And basically, what happened, at least as I interpret it, I've written about this, is that China conquered the world. They see China doing these massive and draconian lockdowns. And however the Chinese government doctored numbers, nobody even knows that. It seems like they control it. They control it. And so, well, this is the way to stop the spreading of this terrible and dangerous and uncertain virus, so that we now copy the central planning of totalitarian shutdowns. And so you see that in Spain and Italy and France and in Britain and the United States, everywhere. So basically, every country in the world followed a Chinese carbon copy model of totalitarian demanding that everybody stop working and stay home.
Unthinkable. And Anthony Fauci back in February said that would never happen in this country because we have the rule of law, Bill of Rights, and freedoms that will never be trampled on. Anthony Fauci said that regarding the China solution applied to here. He said it would never happen. Well, it did happen, in fact. And there's some evidence that actually Chinese propaganda machine was involved in this. I mean, the New York Times ran a big story about more than 100,000 fake Twitter accounts from China that were urging lockdowns on us back in February and March. And I don't know what to make of those claims or whether they had any effect. But yeah, it does make you wonder, why is America following the totalitarian example when we have plenty of examples in our own history of how freedom can manage a pandemic better than statism?
But that's because freedom is tainted with racism and must not be paid attention to.
Another aspect of this, which you're alluding to, is the constitutional aspect that nobody seems to be concerned about. Is where is the constitutional authority for the federal government to do this? As you know, the Constitution calls into existence a national government with enumerated powers. And to make sure they got the point, the Bill of Rights were enacted. But I mean, where do you see the authority for any of these measures that are being taken by the federal government? I mean, there's no grant of authority to regulate, manage, control healthcare, to lock businesses down, and so forth. Even at the state level, there's at least an argument can be made that under the 10th Amendment and the federal system that the states have the traditional inherent powers of regulating the health, safety, morals, welfare of the people. But you've got the 14th Amendment that prohibits the government from taking away liberty without due process of law, property without due process of law, and yet they're engaging in these mandatory shutdowns and mask wearing and threats of incarceration. And yet, where do you see the courts in all this? It brings to mind the notion that in a crisis, that's where your threats to liberty are the worst. And the founders understood that. That was why they didn't put any emergency exception or crisis exception in the Constitution or in the Bill of Rights, because they understood that it is during crises and emergencies that you stand the biggest risk of losing your liberty at the hands of your own government. And I think a lot of people have lost sight of that.
That's right. And, during the American Revolution, there was a smallpox pandemic, actually. And George Washington mandated that his troops couldn't fight with him unless they first got inoculated. And inoculation was an 18th century version of the vaccine. What they would do is somebody who died of smallpox, they would scrape I'm sorry to be morbid, but they would scrape the scabs off the dead to have dead smallpox cells, and they would inject them into their bodies. Very dangerous. But that's what they did. So, and a lot of people died of smallpox during the American Revolution. The revolution didn't stop. That didn't change anybody's mind about freedom. Nobody said, I'm not sure about this Declaration of Independence thing. You think it needs to have a clause in there, that there shouldn't be any human rights in the event of a pandemic? No, they knew and they understood. And so that's why the Constitution never made any exceptions for a crisis. But in our time, I mean, it's actually really interesting. We look at the modern history of how these lockdowns came about. I mean, do you know that it all began under the George W. Bush? It was, remember the 9/11? Well, 9/11 happened, terrible. And then Bush invaded Iraq and invaded Afghanistan. And suddenly we had a president who had a kind of an apocalyptic mind and addicted to extreme actions. And he assigned several government agencies to forge a plan for how they would deal with a bioterrorism that came in the form of a new pathogen. And and two teams ended up presenting before the White House. One consisting of very smart medical professionals who said, well, what you have to do is figure out the pathogen, figure out how it works, and cure people and mitigate and provide therapeutics and that sort of thing. Well, Bush is like asleep during that part. And then the modelers came up with PowerPoint presentations about how they could shut businesses, close down travel, mandate masks, and quarantine everybody. And Bush is like, well, that's impressive. Let's go with that plan. That's much better. So sure enough, by 2007, the CDC had already written into its new disease management strategy all these totalitarian measures, and they sat there for 15 years unused, pretty much, not in 2006, not in 2009. But there were a lot of people like anxious to try this weird social experiment that is unprecedented in human history. So when this came along, there's just a lot of agitation. Trump was initially kind of dismissive of it, but then he got surrounded by these lockdown fanatics dripping poison in his ear. And so on March 12th, he took his big first step, which was banning flights from Europe. I remember listening to that speech that night and like my jaw on the floor. I did not know that a US president had the power to ban flights from Europe. I mean, I was just shocked. Like, can't this court stop this? I mean, who's ever heard of such a thing? And then the next day, March 13th, CDC deployed its glorious central plan and pushed all the states into closing schools and businesses and events and so on. And I am just so respectful of the handful of states that didn't go along. There were 7, but one in particular stands out for having almost no mandated mitigation strategies at all, and that was South Dakota with Kristi Noem, who's just great. I mean, she would give these addresses to her people that would basically summarize the insights of Hayek. These modelers don't know what you know. They pretend to know things they can't know. Government is never smarter than the people. She would give these lectures, and sure enough, South Dakota sailed through this thing with its economy intact. Now people are moving there. They just held this huge convention of 600,000 motorcycle riders. The American press is going crazy about that. And she has emerged as a true national hero in the course of this thing. But it turned out to be very difficult to resist the federal government's impositions. Now, it's true that about a month later, Trump began to wonder whether or not he had been gaslighted. And I think to this day, he does wonder about that. And in fact, the doctors that urged him to do this are now kind of out. And he's bringing new people in like Scott Alice from Hoover, who's a sensible guy. So I'm fairly optimistic things will change. But I think your point is more foundational. Should the federal government have the power to do this at all, to have this kind of discretion to act or not act? And I think the answer from a constitutional point of view is absolutely not. Never. No. Under no circumstances.
I think another element of it is that, well, yes, there have been some instances like in South Dakota. What needs to be looked at and analyzed also as a sociological phenomenon is the governments declare these shutdowns and lockdowns, and how the mass of the population of countries that are supposedly even not anymore, part of the Western tradition of rule of law, a sense of privacy and degrees of personal freedom, virtually everyone just passively obeys what their governments tell them. The Spanish government says you can't go out. The Italian government says you can't go out. The French, the British, the German, the US government, either the federal or the state, you can't go out. You can't go to work. You can only, you have to stay 6 feet apart. Or in Michigan, you have to cordon off part of your supermarket, your Costco warehouse, that certain things can't be sold. And everybody just accepts this. You see, this is a fundamental sociological problem in the society we have. People in their minds cannot imagine a situation in which government can be wrong and they should doubt what it's doing and their need to obey. And we have to be thinking about this because this is a serious sociological pathology.
It's a very serious problem. And I think a lot of people were just panicked. I think they figured, look, this must be much more serious than I know. Government must know something I don't know, or else they wouldn't be taking away everything I thought of as being the essence of American life, from baseball to outdoor barbecues to playing in the park to schools and Broadway. You're going to abolish all of that. There must be a really good reason. But as the months have dragged on, what I'm seeing is a lot more public incredulity. A friend of mine compared it, had an interesting analogy. He said, people, when they first move to a coastal town, and they have a house right there and sort of in the path of a hurricane, when the Weather Channel comes along and says, "Oh, this is the mother of all storms," in the very first year, they board up their houses, they hop in their cars, and they drive to get away. And then they come back to the house later and realize that it was just a little bit of rain, that it was media hysteria. By year 2, 3, 4, and 5, they start to get cynical, and when they hear the latest storm, disaster coming out, they just shut off the channel and decide to kind of move on with their lives. I wonder if maybe we're going through something like this right now. I don't think a lot of the American people have ever experienced anything so weird as a government coming along and saying, we're going to protect you from a virus. I think that struck people as very odd, and a lot of people got scared. One very interesting young woman who was here, when she came, she was all to AIR. She was all masked up and afraid to shake hands and walking around and after about a week, she just relaxed and said, this is dumb. Why am I doing this? And kind of got educated a little bit. And I asked her later, I said, can you tell me something? Why were you so afraid to the point of extreme compliance and disabling your own sense of your own personal human rights and freedom? What led you to that? And she said something strange and interesting to me. She goes, well, for my generation, this is the first thing that's ever really happened to us. And so it's kind of exciting. It made us feel alive that something big was taking place. Up to now, it's only been Instagram, TikTok, and sitting in classes all the time. And that's kind of boring. So this was kind of exciting. And a lot of us just wanted to throw ourselves into it to so we could experience some kind of drama.
Given that it's interesting you put it that way.
Richard, speak up a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting that you put it that way, because think of what some historians have pointed out about when World War I came along. Supposedly, who knows what people really thought. The interpretations are people before the First World found their lives boring, monotonous. It was all peaceful and private, humdrum everyday life. And now, war. And, when you're a little kid thinking of before the First World War, you're thinking of knights and shining armor and fighting Vikings. And, that's your impression. And now you get to go and besides, it'll all be over by Christmas anyway. It's August of 1914. Hurrah, hurrah. Like the picture of that mass crowd in Munich that they found Hitler in. Remember that photograph in August of 1914? The excitement. Now this is an adventure. I'm going to be heroic on the battlefield. And that's an interesting parallel of psychology, of breaking out of the monotonous and the humdrum and the seeming meaningless of your everyday life.
That's it. That's right. That's right. The disease is the force that gave us meaning. That is a very strange psychology. Mm-hmm. And I don't know exactly what we're supposed to do. The famous political philosopher, actually, was the evil Nazi, Carl Schmitt, yes, said that the people's hunger for drama and bigness and fights and ferocity and enemies and all that kind of stuff is so intense that liberalism can never work, because liberalism is boring. The world of Benjamin Constant and Adam Smith is unsatisfying to the human spirit. I think that's something that we as libertarians need to address and overcome. This is one of the reasons, by the way, I really I appreciate Ayn Rand, actually, because within Ayn Rand you do find this kind of drama, this ferocity, this idea that freedom is exciting and that you can be heroic within the context of freedom, and that the state offers you a fake and failed paradigm of drama where it's not heroic, it's actually just bludgeoning people, and it's brutal and it's terrible and ruins the world. So that's I think one of Rand's great contributions was to present as you say, boring old freedom as actually tremendously exciting. I think that's a real challenge for us in the days ahead, is to get people excited about having their human rights back again, and living full lives within the framework of liberty. That's extremely important.
You know,
I think
one of the things that Hayek has, is that society does not have a purpose. The spontaneous order of the market is the institutional setting in which individuals can have their own purposes and meanings, both for themselves and in voluntary association in conjunction with others. And what has to be appreciated and explained to people is that you don't need to turn to the state for meaning and purpose. Make America great again, or have a goal to get to the moon, or now to Mars, or all the other things that are raised. Like all the kids have to be organized and made to clean up the underbrush at national parks. You have to have a sense of belonging together. That is a false sense of identity and human association. The right sense of meaning and association is the ones that you give through yourself and want to and emerge out of yourself, and you find those who have like-minded purposes and goals to go with you in these associations of civil society, and that the state is this false hope for this that in fact ends up being a cul-de-sac of disaster.
Yeah, I think the point that both of you make is so good. There was that famous exchange between two of the founding fathers, Paine and somebody else, where one of them said, "Wherever there is liberty, that is my home." And the other one said, "Oh, wherever there is not liberty, that is my home." And I think that's the way we see it as libertarians. I mean, we were born and raised in a tyrannical, oppressive system, and there's a joy and an enjoyment of fighting the good fight, fighting for freedom. This is a beautiful philosophy. I think libertarianism is the greatest political and economic philosophy ever. There's excitement, and the problem is I think a lot of libertarians get despondent. They don't see the progress. They see the actual opposite. They get burned out, and they fail to see the positive side, the enjoyment, the excitement of this philosophy in and of itself, but also battling to see its achievement.
Yeah, two things come to mind. One, by the way, is the great writer Albert J. Nock. He also said this line about where there is liberty, there is my home. I love the book Memoirs of a Superfluous Man, but I think it helps detach you in a sense from the nation state project as a goal-oriented thing and a collective that we have to be part of. Albert J. Nock's a good one to read on that. Another thing that comes to mind is Richard, I know you kind of despair about the way the American people have responded to lockdowns with not enough pushback. And I think that's right. But I tell you, it's a lot worse in a lot of other places in the world. Australia and New Zealand have both responded to this thing in the most egregiously unscientific and I would even say sort of nationally selfish ways. They decided to shut their countries down to avoid the virus completely. They really believed that they could just wall up both Australia and New Zealand and keep the disease out forever. And there's until very recently, of course, because the disease gets in eventually, there is tremendous national pride all over Australia and New Zealand. We have figured it out. We alone are the great country and everybody was bought into this lie. And now the lie has been shattered because the virus is all over the place in Melbourne. Now they're locked down and everybody's a prisoner in their house again. And New Zealand, oh my God, they're arresting people on the streets, and you try to empty your trash at the wrong time in Auckland, you're thrown in jail. Even traveling, there's a case just the other day, but this young woman went to go visit a sick relative in Sydney, came back, was trying to sneak back into Western Australia in a car inside of a truck, hiding, and they found her and put her in jail for 6 months. A young woman of 25 years old who was just trying to get back to her home. So this is totalitarianism, and it's particularly horrible when you see people celebrating it. And I tell you what, I hope that there's a lesson here for not just Australia and New Zealand, but everyone in the world. Do not give governments this power. They will abuse it and take away your rights and do nothing to mitigate the disease. I'm so grateful we have an example of Sweden. Now, Sweden went too far in banning temporarily meetings of more than 50 people and stuff like that. But they kept restaurants open, the schools open, and everything that was open. They had almost no lockdown at all. And the results are fantastic. They had a higher deaths than their neighbors, but lower than UK, Spain, Italy, Peru, and many other states. And now they've achieved herd immunity. And the thing is, for all practical purposes, completely gone there. And the society's totally open, and they didn't destroy their economy. So I'm really grateful for that example.
Yeah, let me wrap it up in a few minutes we have left. Jeff, as you know, we're advocates of open borders, and you appeared with us on a panel. And when this thing first started up, there were people saying, "Oh, well, this really shows why we need controlled borders." And of course, my answer is, "How's that working out for you?" And here domestically, we have open borders between the states, and I was very curious to see whether there were going to be any calls for closed borders from those states where the virus hadn't hit yet. And there were a few sporadic calls, but nothing like you would expect at least internationally on international borders. I mean, people were saying, look, our freedom matters more than anything here. We're not going to have border controls between the states to protect us from this. And the same principle, of course, applies internationally.
The literature on the subject, Jacob, is incontrovertible. Travel restrictions do nothing to mitigate disease. That sounds a little counterintuitive because you think, oh no, but if people travel, no, there has never been a travel restriction in modern history that's done anything to control a virus. So it's wrong. Donald Henderson also said this in 2006, citing all the literature. He said, never institute travel restrictions. We did that. We went so far down this road. We've basically, do you know this? Like even today, most American consulates in the world are shut down. So you can't even travel to the U.S., much less get a visa, H-1B visa, or any of the other visas, student visas, to come to the United States. My God, and it's been catastrophic. I mean, for American businesses and for human rights and real people's lives, Oh, and then of course Europe retaliated by banning Americans, right? So we have got to fix this. I would say in terms of priorities, open the consulates, legalize the age of the visas process again, allow Europeans and other people to travel here, and they will open up their borders too. And we've got to get back to being a global society. Oh, I have one more thing to tell you that you'll be fascinated by. Sunatra Gupta at Oxford University makes the most interesting argument. She said that free migration and free trade that came to the world, the globalism that came to the world after World War I, is responsible for building the most robust immune systems that have ever existed on planet Earth. And she said, this is one of the reasons we're so good at resisting disease now and why we live such a long life. She credits capitalism for doing that to our evolutionary biology. More mixing of more people makes us more resistant to disease because our immune systems are work with a code, and we get more inputs and we build more resistance. So that's Gupta's position. The capitalism has made us healthy in precisely that very interesting way. She's an epidemiologist herself, and I was a little bit blown away by that argument. I mean, that makes the case for more immigration, more travel, more trade, more globalism.
That's fascinating. Richard, any parting words here?
I would like to say that I am one of the regular writers for the American Institute for Economic Research. And Jeff is the He's the manager, the editorial manager for AIER. And he does a superb job of putting out unbelievably superb literature. Now, obviously, the focus over the last 6-7 months or so has been on this. I've tried to humbly write a few pieces myself on that theme, besides others. But because of Jeff's leadership, the AIER has been a spearhead for reasonable, rational thinking on this government catastrophe, and not only explaining economically and politically the disaster of it, but to hammer away how it has failed, the facts as the months have progressed, how this has failed, and not even achieved the purposes that the instigators and the interveners wanted. And if any of you are interested in this subject and a whole variety of subjects, besides going to FFF, an excellent place with articles every day, just like FFF, you can find articles on these themes and freedom at the website of the American Institute for Economic Research, www.aier.org. And you will be loaded with literature to help what Ayn Rand used to call the intellectual ammunition to bolster yourself against the arguments of the collectivists.
I'm so pleased that we can share content with Future of Freedom Foundation. I think it's just fantastic. We've been great partners over these last 6 to 8 months, and I wish there had been more of us, but I think we've done a pretty good job, and I think we're really starting to make a difference. Ideas, I think this is why you both do this. We all believe that ideas can make a difference in the world, can change the world, and without them, we're going to sink back in serfdom just as fast as we have over the last 6 months. So thank you for keeping your hopes up, for doing such wonderful writing and work, and for really being a benefactor of the whole of humanity, for opposing these lockdowns and making sure that we build societies in which this kind of thing never happens again. So I'd also like to thank you for inviting me on today and letting me talk so much. So thank you both so much.
The feeling is mutual, and thank you so much for taking the time and for your fantastic and enlightening comments. This has been really a lot of fun. If people want to contact you, Jeff, how would they do that?
My Twitter is always open. I accept direct messages there. So Jeffrey A. Tucker, and then also at the website of the AIER.org, I have my email address there, but I'm glad to correspond and work with anybody on this very important topic.
Now, before we close, we all have to know, what does the A stand for?
My father's name, Albert.
Albert!
Yeah.
Richard, I don't think I understood you correctly. Let me just throw a question at you. Did you say that you did something humbly?
Now, Jeff, you see what I have to put up with this every week. Every week. But I'm so good in my humbleness that I just let it go by.
Well, you're one of the most humble people you know. All right. Thank you all for tuning in. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Come and visit us at fff.org. Go to aier.org. We're all putting in this principled message on libertarianism. We're all devoted to getting this country back on the right track, the track to liberty, peace, prosperity, and harmony. Thank you for tuning in. Thanks for your great support, and we look forward to seeing you next week.